Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and tonight I'd like to talk as a homeschooling father to homeschooling parents, and I'd like to ask homeschooling parents to think with me a little bit about their mission, our mission in our work as homeschooling parents, because I'd like to challenge Catholic parents to think a little more broadly about their Catholic life and mission, which is just beginning as homeschool parents. One of the great discouragements that we have to battle against as Catholics is that there's so much to learn. There's so much beauty and wisdom in the Catholic faith for us to enjoy. And many of us, we learn about it later in life. We learn about it after we've already wasted many years messing around in the world or wrapped up in other religious groups and things like that. And we finally get our act together as Catholics, and sometimes we look and we see how much there is to study and do as Catholics, and we just say, unfortunately, I got a late start. It's too late for me. So I'm just going to sort of check the boxes because I missed my chance. And I often hear from adult Catholics who are just sort of writing off the opportunity to pursue a great education, even as adults, because they just missed their chance. And I hear that talk a lot. And I think Catholics have a great fault in thinking wrongly about their lives and opportunities and the timeline of their lives. And I'd like to challenge Catholic parents on this topic. If you're a homeschooling parent, a Catholic homeschooling parent, and you may be getting started and your children are young, you may be finishing up and your children are already adults, you may be somewhere in the middle where you've got some kids at the higher end of their studies and some kids just getting started. Anywhere in between, you know that you probably look back with a lot of regret. You look back and say, oh, I should have done this. I wish I could have done this. I wish I knew this earlier. If I had a second chance, I would do this, and so on. But you probably just say, yeah, but I did at each step. I did what I understood to be right, and there's nothing else I could do, and I'm not going to beat myself up over it because I did what I could, and that's true. And you should have that. You should have that attitude. But the truth is, we're all just getting started. We're all just getting started. And we've got years and years of life, God willing. We've got many years left to study and work and help others. And I want to challenge you to take off the homeschooling parent hat and just put on the Catholic adult hat. And instead of living inside of this box of homeschooling and thinking about your own children and the work that needs to be done to get them through their studies and to check all the boxes, I'd like to ask you to think more broadly as a Catholic adult. I'd like to challenge you, first of all, to take up these studies as your own. Study theology, study philosophy, learn the classical languages, study history, study the 7 liberal arts. I encourage you to study these things. The idea that you missed your chance is just foolishness. That's not true at all. It doesn't take 70 years to learn these studies, and if you don't start when you're 10, you just say, oh, well, I missed my chance. No, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. If we look back through history, look back at the lives of the saints, you'll find many famous saints got a late start. Learn about St. Ignatius of Loyola, for example. He started his classical Catholic studies when he was at least in his 30s, if not even older than that. He had to go and study in grammar classes with kids because he wanted to become a priest, and he had to go through the liberal arts curriculum just like everyone else does, and he went back and took grammar classes with kids as classmates. If you look back at the lives of the saints, you'll see that many of them got a late start. And getting a late start certainly has some disadvantages because you just miss those years where you could have been studying and growing, and you get to start later. But there's also advantages. You know, one of the advantages of getting a late start is you're mature. And even though you might have had 10 extra years if you were younger, you probably wouldn't have used that time as wisely as you can use it as an adult, because you're just older, you're more disciplined, hopefully, you have more self-control, and you know, having years to study in your 30s or 40s or even 20s or even older, having years to study can be very productive because you can make better use of the time that you do have, most of which you would waste as a child anyway. So don't allow that argument to get into your head that it's too late to get started. I encourage you to take up these studies because you've got years and years and years to live, and it doesn't take a long time to make significant progress in these studies. I mean, there's a number of adults who I work with who are studying, and they're making pretty good progress, even though they're in their 30s and 40s, maybe even older. They're making good progress, and I think that they would be the first to tell you that even the little bit that they've studied so far has already begun to be helpful for them as Catholics. So I encourage you as Catholic adults, forget the homeschool parent thing. As Catholic adults, as Catholics, I encourage you to take up these studies on your own and sacrifice your leisure time to gain wisdom. You know, if you think about it, if you're in your 30s or 40s, I'm 47 years old. I'm working every day and studying because I want to be a wise 70-year-old. I want to be a wise 70-year-old. And that's what I think about when I think about studying and working. I'm not necessarily studying for what I'm going to do today or tomorrow. I'm thinking, if God wills and I live for another 20 years, so I'm 67 years old, or even longer, God willing, I could be 90. I would like to collect wisdom over these next 20 years that I can share at the end of my life. My arms are not going to be strong. My back's not going to be strong. My legs will be weak. I'm not going to be able to help anyone carry things or do physical labor. But as an old man, if God grants me strength of mind, which he normally does for older people, if God grants me strength of mind, I would like to be able to help the next generation and the next generation by being an old, experienced, wise counselor. And that's a role, if you think about it in your life, who are the old, wise counselors in your life? Most of us don't even have any. I know I don't have an old man, an old Catholic man that I could, call up or visit to ask some questions. I don't know men like that. When I was in college, I was blessed with the opportunity to have an older retired professor who I didn't even know was a Catholic at the time. I didn't learn that until later, but I was fortunate to have a few old men that I became friends with who would invite me to their house and make themselves available to help me with things. But as a 47-year-old man, I don't have men like that right now in my life. And I think that my condition is pretty common. I don't think there are many 40-plus-year-old men who have older men. And I don't just mean older men, I mean wise older men. Men who have studied, men who know the Catholic faith, men who know the teachings of the doctors of the church, men who are well studied in the catechism, who know the lives of the saints, who have experience in business and family life and all different undertakings in adult society. There aren't many men to look up to as counselors in this generation. And in our 40s and younger, we have the opportunity to develop ourselves to become that generation of counselors for younger generations in 20 years from now. And that's what should motivate our studies. At least that's what should provide one motivation for our studies. Thoughts of being able to give back to younger generations when we're older, and using the time we have now to store up the knowledge and wisdom and experience that we can share in the future. So we should be studying not to make ourselves wise 40-year-olds, because that opportunity may be past. But we have the opportunity to study to make ourselves wise 50-year-olds or 60-year-olds or 70-year-olds. And that's what should motivate us. We're going to enter into a different phase of life. And now is the time to prepare for that phase of life. I can use my own life as an example. I wasted high school. My K-12 education was a waste. I wasn't well parented. I didn't understand the importance of studies and things like that. And I wasted my K-12 years. And then I went through a conversion experience as an 18-year-old. And from 18 through my 20s, I made up for the time that I wasted in K-12 studies. And I would say that I came out of my 20s as well educated as anyone, as engaged professionally as anyone, as responsible as anyone. And so even though I wasted a big chunk of my younger years, I made great strides in my 20s, in my later teens and through my 20s, especially my early 20s. Because when other 20-year-olds were goofing around and wasting time, I was locked in and I was making progress. And I made up for my wasted teenage years with well-used time in my 20s, and I continued that in my 30s, and I'm continuing that in my 40s. And so even though we may fall behind at a certain point, because others will fall behind later, we have the opportunity to pick up our pace and get to work and make up for lost time in the past by more diligent study in the present, and prepare ourselves to be something in the future that we won't be unless we make good use of the present. So I want to encourage homeschooling parents, Catholic adults, I want to encourage you to take up these studies for your own with a view of developing yourself to become a useful, older Catholic adult in your parish, in your family, in your community, and so on. Think of that role and how useful it would be to so many people to have an older, well-studied, philosophical, wisdom-seeking, devout, older Catholic man or woman in the community, and be that person. Study and work to prepare to be that person in 10, 15, 20 years from now. Take up these studies. The second thing I'd like to say to homeschool parents is realize that your time with your children, as important as it is, and you should pour everything you've got into the education of your children, but at the same time, it's a temporary work. It's a part or a phase of your life that's going to end. And it's going to end while you're still young. My wife and I were talking this morning because, like I said, we're 47 years old. And, our youngest child is now 8 years old. And my wife is no longer a nursing, pregnant woman who needs to be home taking care of babies. There's no more babies. Our youngest is 8. She's a second grade age student. And we're now entering into a different phase of life. We're no longer the parents of little children. We're now the parents of adults and school-age children, and the number of adults is increasing year by year now. So we're entering into a different phase of life, and it's exciting. It's exciting to realize that a lot of the things that were on our plates 5-10 years ago are no longer on our plate. A lot of the burdens that we had to bear 5 and 10 years ago, we no longer need to bear those. We're free to do other things. And fortunately for us, because we looked ahead to this phase of our life and developed our work in education and other things that we've done, we're excited to have the opportunity now in a different phase of life to get to work with these projects. Because when we were homeschooling our kids, we didn't live in sort of a tunnel vision world focused on homeschooling our kids. We knew that it was going to be temporary, and we knew that there was going to be life after homeschooling, and we prepared ourselves for that life. And that's what I'd like to encourage other Catholic parents to think about and do. Realize that your homeschooling years, as challenging as they may be, are just a phase. It's just a temporary part of your life as a Catholic, which is much broader than that. And the question is, looking forward, what are you going to do after homeschooling? What are you going to do when there's no more day-to-day homeschool work that needs to be done, and you're in a new phase of life as a, let's say, mid-40s, early 50-year-old Catholic adult? What are you going to do when there's no more homeschooling? Think about that and prepare for it. Prepare for that next phase. As a homeschooling parent, don't get lost in homeschooling. I tell my wife all the time, homeschooling is a black hole. There's no limit. You could devote 24 hours a day to homeschooling, and at the end of your homeschooling years, it may not make much of a difference, because there are requirements that need to be fulfilled, and you can complete those requirements within a balanced life where you're also developing other interests and pursuits. Or you can just exhaust everything you have on those requirements, and in the end, it's not going to make much of a difference, because formal schooling, even though this is unpopular, formal schooling is really not that big of a deal. It's really not that difficult to lead your kids through their, let's say, high school diplomas and transcripts for college admission and career it's not hard if you know what you're doing. It's not difficult. And what parents often do is they just think that if they just pour more and more and more attention into that pot, it's going to get better and better, and it doesn't. There's a certain level after which it's just wasted time and effort, because you're just pouring all of this energy and all of these resources and all of this time into this limited bucket of things that need to be done. And in the end, the same result is going to be produced, whether you put just the amount of time and energy that's necessary, or whether you put in 5 times the amount of time and energy and money that's necessary. Formal schooling is not difficult. The standards are very low for what's necessary, and for the kids to move on to the next phase of their lives, they don't need 24/7 formal schooling, because the requirements are actually much less than that, and there's a lot of other stuff that they need. They need social formation. They need character training. They need moral, philosophical formation and things like that. And then they're going to make all kinds of bad decisions and fall into sins. As soon as they get their own independence and they're out of your control, they're going to make all kinds of mistakes, and there's going to be a phase of their life where they go through all of their youthful follies. There's no way for you to keep them from that. If there was a way, then the Bible would simply warn us not to allow it to happen and threaten us if we do allow it to happen. But we don't control other human beings. And you have to understand the duties of parents so that you don't make mistakes, because you're going to invest things in that education that should have been invested into other parts of your life or other parts of your children's lives or other phases of your own life. And instead you wasted everything on this black hole of homeschooling for no reason. You have to be careful not to do too much. It's common to do too little in homeschooling, and many families are doing too little. But it's also common to try to do too much. And it's not healthy for your Catholic life overall to do too much in homeschooling. And that's what I'd like to encourage you to think about. When you look to the future, you may have grandchildren, you may have great-grandchildren. No matter what, whether your children have children or your children get married or don't get married or you don't end up with grandchildren, you're still a member of the Catholic Church. You're still a member of the communion of saints. And you should be studying and working and investing and praying that you'll leave the Catholic faith in a better condition than you received it, as far as is within your power. And the question is, are we doing that as Catholics? And I don't think that we are. I don't think that we're doing a good job. Our generation is not on pace to leave the Catholic faith in a better condition than we received it. If we look around, we see Catholic schools closing. We see all different kinds of Catholic cultural resources disappearing. We see Catholic culture in general disappearing little by little. It doesn't look like we're going to leave the world in a better condition from a Catholic perspective than we received it in. There are obviously some bright points. There are some things that are encouraging. And there's a lot that's discouraging, and we've got a lot of work to do. And we're as responsible for the Catholic faith as a whole and the part we play in it as members of the laity. And remember, the mission of the laity is described for us in the Catechism as working to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. That's what the laity is supposed to do. You and I, as members of the laity, have the duty of directing, not just participating in temporal affairs, not in withdrawing from temporal affairs, as if that was the test. The role of the laity is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. Are we doing that? Are we directing temporal affairs? Are you directing temporal affairs according to the will of God? Whatever temporal affairs, whatever worldly activities are in your control, are you directing them according to the will of God? And are you fulfilling your potential and directing whatever temporal affairs you could direct? Or are you taking, an easier path and just leaving that for others and ignoring it, saying, that's none of my business? It is our business. As laity, we chose not to be monks. We chose not to be nuns, not to be brothers or sisters. We chose not to live in monasteries or convents. We chose not to devote our lives to contemplation. We chose to enter into the laity, into secular life, and we're responsible to direct that secular life according to the will of God. Are we doing that? That's what we should be asking ourselves. Are we fulfilling the role that we've chosen as members of the Catholic laity? And there's a lot of work to do. And so what I'd like to appeal to you with, or what I'd like to talk about is, I'd like to encourage you to consider the bigger picture, not of Catholic homeschooling or Catholic parenting, but of your Catholic life in general, your Catholic adult life, your Catholic life as a member of the laity. And I'd like it to challenge you to think beyond homeschooling. Think beyond this generation. Think beyond your own children. Think about other Catholic children. Think about the next generation of Catholic children. Think about 5 generations from now of Catholic children. And ask yourself, how can you help? How can you contribute? How can you participate in the mission of the laity and direct temporal affairs according to the will of God for the good of all of these other Catholics, future Catholics, fellow Catholics, and so on? Not just your own 5 or 6 children, not just your own generation, not just the Catholics you know, but think of yourself as a member of this communion of saints. You know, when we look back to the old philosophers, the doctors of the church, and so on, they took study very seriously. They took their writing work very seriously because they believed that it was their duty, it was their Christian duty to advance Christian knowledge, to clarify Christian teaching for the next generation. They believed that that was their duty. That's why they worked so diligently at it. It didn't matter that they couldn't necessarily influence their own generation. They understood that that's really not how things work. Like Jesus said, a prophet is not honored in his own town. Many amazing men and women are at work at present who are despised and, not considered very significant because we underestimate them because they're just our fellow Christians. They're our fellow Catholics. We don't think they're all that great, but in the next generation, the fruits of the work that they do will begin to be born, and their influence will begin to be felt. And it's difficult for us to evaluate that while we're living in the world. And we've got to think about what we're doing, not as homeschooling parents, because our life is much broader than that. Our mission is much broader than that. What are we doing as Catholic adults overall to advance the Catholic faith, to clarify Catholic teaching, to influence temporal affairs so that our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids and just the children of other Catholics have it better than we had it? How can we make Catholic culture better for them than it was for us? All of the obstacles that you've faced as a Catholic adult, how can you work to eliminate those obstacles from the paths of future Catholics? All the troubles you've had in educating your own children, how can you work to solve those problems so that the next generation of Catholics has a solution and doesn't have to have the same struggles that you had? If there were resources that you wish you had as a Catholic that weren't available, why can't you work to help make those resources available so that in the next generation they don't have the same problems? That's how I wish we could think as Catholics, because there's so much work to be done. There's so much that can be done. And I think what happens in this modern culture is we isolate ourselves with our nuclear family. It's just husband, wife, and their children, and we put a box around the nuclear family, and it's like a contest to see whose nuclear family can be best. I mean, we see this on social media, and it just seems like the nuclear family, instead of connecting with and collaborating with other families to form a society, to form a community which benefits everyone, where everyone shares all of their gifts and talents and resources for the improvement of everyone. Instead, it seems to be an isolated contest where every family sets itself up as a separate team and views all the other families as opponents. And so the family locks itself in and tries to pour every single resource it has into its own isolated family. We can see a parallel of this in politics, where we see people arguing for this America First policy. But obviously there's nothing wrong with America First, but what happens is it tends to become America Only. That's the problem. That's the criticism of conservative economics, is that Ronald Reagan proposed a trickle-down model for economy where we support private business, we try to reduce taxes and give business leaders and innovators support and freedom to profit, and then as they profit and work, the abundance will overflow and then begin to trickle down to the rest of society. And the criticism of trickle-down economics is that it seems that the glass just keeps getting higher and higher, and it never trickles down. And this is what happens in family life as well. We start by saying, well, we're going to try to build a strong family, and we're going to try to establish these things for our children. But then the standards it's covetous and competitive, and it's like the walls just keep getting higher and higher and higher, and it doesn't benefit anyone else. It's just this contest of this cultural or spiritual greed that sets its own family up against the other families, rather than realizing that these families are all supposed to be working together. I consider my teaching abilities, my intellectual abilities, I consider them a gift from God, and I believe that God gave this gift to me not just to give to my own children or to keep for the benefit of my own nuclear family, but it's to share with all Christians, and it's to edify the whole Christian community, as many people as can benefit from it, to make my work available for others to share. And I believe it's the responsibility of the next Catholic with his unique gifts and abilities to do the same thing, and the musician and the lawyer and the architect and the doctor and the all of the different workers. We're not just competing and say, well, who's got the best gifts? He gets to make the most money and live in the nicest house in isolation, where he just hoards all of the fruits of his giftedness. No, his gifts are given to him for the edification of all, for the service of all. And that's where I think the Catholic laity in this generation, because of modern education, because of the whole college admission fantasy world, we think that it's a contest to see who can assemble the most impressive family life in competition against everyone else, as if there is going to be some reward for the best family when all is said and done. There's no such reward. There's no such reward, and if you're honest and look, you'll see that this really doesn't produce happiness, because even our own children, they long for relationships outside the family. Even as individual Catholic adults, we need relationships outside the family, and this isolated homeschool culture is just not good for us. It's not good for our children. And we see this when we isolate the nuclear family, which is commonly done in the name of homeschooling. When we isolate, we raise social misfits. And though they may have all kinds of interesting knowledge from their studies, it's not useful, because they're not winsome, active young men and women. And so we can see that this model where the family focuses on itself, invests everything in its own education and benefit, it doesn't produce Christian society. Whereas faith working through love being the model, everyone understands, if they truly believe that their gifts are from God, that's one thing to say, I have this gift, it's from God. I can prove it's from God. There's no way to explain how I can do what I do without divine intervention, without grace. Well, that may be true of the source of the gift, but what we have to ask is, what is the purpose of the gift? What is the end of that gift? And the end of that gift is not for the enrichment of my nuclear family. The end of that gift is for the edification of Christian society, of the Christian community. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? How are we using our gifts for the edification of the Christian community at large? Not just our own family, not even just our own generation, but how are we taking these gifts that we've received from God and putting them to work so that God receives an increase? That's what the parables in the Gospels teach us. God gives 10 talents to this servant, 5 talents to this servant, and a talent to this servant, and sends them out to go and do business, as it were. And then they come back and they report to the Lord and they say, look, you gave me 10 and I put it to work and I took in 50. And they bring back this report of their profit to the Lord, the master in the parable. And it's showing us the purpose of these gifts. God gives them to us not to bury in the ground for our own enjoyment, but God gives them to us for us to put to work for the glory of God, for the benefit of his people, for the benefit of our whole community. And we have to ask, how are we doing that? And that's why I'd like to challenge you to think beyond your nuclear family. Nobody really cares. You're going to be frustrated when you realize that when all's said and done, your children grow up and leave home and move on, and nobody really cares how perfect your 10-year-old children were. Life is a lot messier than that. And what's going to remain after your children become adults, you don't control their future. What's going to remain is the Christian community. What's going to remain is the parish community. What's going to remain are works that you undertook which reached beyond, the material or the cultural prosperity of your own nuclear family. What's going to remain after your nuclear family more or less dissolves as your children move into adulthood and go start their own families. What's going to remain is the work that you've done for the Christian community overall as a member of the communion of saints, as a member of the Catholic laity. What have we done overall for the benefit of all? That's what's going to remain. And our children are really just some of the recipients whom we seek to benefit using the gifts that God has given us. We have unique obligations to them as their parents, but it's not to spoil them. It's not to just continually give and give and give and give without limit to just our own children. That's not even virtuous. And so the question is, how are our Catholic lives influencing the greater Catholic society? How are we working to improve Catholic culture for the next generation or for 5 generations down the road? And there are so many works that need attention in our generation that we're neglecting. One of them is education. Like I said, Catholic education is lost. The K-12 schools in Catholic circles, they're financially unsustainable. They're copied from the public school model, which is funded by taxation, and there's no way that Catholic education can continue long. It basically lasted a century and is crumbling because the K-12 model is not sustainable for private education. And so we're going to see this century or so of Catholic parochial schools, K-12 Catholic schools, continue to disappear because it's not sustainable. Education is a huge area where work needs to be done, or there's going to be no Catholic education available. Just think of your own situation. Think of how difficult it is for you to Educate your children. Do you want to leave the next generation with the same trouble, maybe even worse? Because not only did we not create solutions for them, but we just didn't even care. We just took care of our own kids, and then when they were done, we just stopped. Education is a huge opportunity for Catholic laity to work and build and invest in the future. And it doesn't mean starting schools, because I really believe that schools are obsolete. It doesn't mean trying to copy public schools, trying to create 20th century schools in the 21st century. I don't believe that that's a plan. We need to restore curriculum. We need to build affordable educational systems that are available for all Catholics anywhere. And that's what we're doing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And we need help. There's so much work to do. I laugh because I get emails every day from parents asking, what about this? What about this? Is this lesson done yet? What about this course? What about this? As if somehow I'm the only person who's allowed to do these things. It's work for us to do. The resources that are needed, the study materials that are needed. It would be great to go back and get all of these books that we're using and studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and bring them all back into print. That's a massive project for the Catholic laity to engage in. All of the works of Aristotle, all of the writings of St. Thomas, all of the writings of the great philosophers and wise men of the past, to get all of these works retyped and into print fresh in the 21st century is a huge project. Catholic music, Catholic devotional life, Catholic culture in general, Catholic art, Catholic humanities, all of these areas are screaming for help. And there's nobody working in them. And it's not difficult work. It's, I often tell the students when I'm teaching them about their studies, I say, there's a giant mountain in front of you that needs to be moved. But it's a mountain that's composed of small stones. And you simply need to move one stone at a time. And move as many as you can for as long as you can. And that's how you should think about this work. No one can move the whole mountain. No one can move the mountain in one motion. But it doesn't need to be moved like that. If you move as many stones as you can, you're helping. And the mountain can be moved. And this mountain that we need to move is this loss of Catholic culture. And it's intellectual, it's aesthetic, it's cultural, it's financial and professional. I mean, there's so many different levels at which Catholic culture is languishing. And it's work that we need to engage in. We need to work and sacrifice and invest with noble goals to try and leave the Catholic faith, as far as the laity is concerned. The clergy is not our business. As far as the temporal affairs that we're supposed to be directing, we need to figure out how to work to leave everything in a better condition than it was for us. Wasting time, you see all these lay people wrangling about the liturgy, wrangling about priests and the Pope and the bishops and all. They're just meddling in other people's business. That's not our business. That's not our business. If you're so concerned about religious life and liturgy and these things, you should have been a priest. You should have chosen religious life. But you're not a religious. You're a lay person. And you're supposed to be directing temporal affairs, not ecclesiastical affairs, not liturgical affairs. You're supposed to be directing temporal affairs according to the will of God. And all the people criticizing the clergy, criticizing liturgy, criticizing the Pope and so on, they're simply neglecting their responsibility. I would say that they're deceived by this appearance of religious activity, this appearance of zeal for the Catholic faith, which is really just, it's just a show. It's just it's all, it's a smoke screen for the actual neglect of their duty in the Catholic life as laymen, which is to be directing temporal affairs according to the will of God. Not ecclesiastical affairs, not liturgical affairs, which are none of the laity's business, but temporal affairs. We're secular laity. The world is our business. And we're not doing our job in directing temporal affairs. So what I'd like to challenge Catholic parents to think about is how can we together work to do something positive? And I'm not talking stupid. I'm not talking, let's end world hunger. You get people talking about all these nonsense, global projects and all that. That's nonsense. That's not our business. Let's start with simple things. Let's move some stones before we talk about moving mountains. Let's move some stones. Let's get Catholic education restored to a degree where the next generation doesn't have to talk about what they're going to do with education. Let's get a system of education restored and beautified and made efficient and affordable for the next generation. Let's get necessary Christian works for study, classical and Catholic studies. Let's get those works back into print for the next generation. Let's establish these resources and tools, because this is something that's immediately in our control. Let's start there, because if we start there and get these things established, then perhaps we can move on to the next level and start working on next level stuff, because we have opportunities to do great things, but we have to move stones before we can move any mountains. And we're not moving stones. So if you're interested in getting involved in this kind of work, I have at my disposal the tools and resources that we need to do those things. It's just a matter of having workers to do it, and to do it with quality, not just to do some minimum requirement junk work as if you're doing someone a favor. That's not what's needed. It needs to be quality work. It needs to be work that we take seriously, that we do for God's glory. We do for the good of our fellow Catholics, future generations of men, women, and children who need help, who need us to work for them to make their Catholic life better and easier than ours was. There's a lot of work to do, and it's simple. And you can see the things that I do as an example. You can see, for example, the classical Catholic radio and how we can just start bringing quality Catholic music back into Christian homes. It's not complicated. It's simple. We can develop things like that. You see how I'm starting the classical Catholic bookstore, which will establish the mechanism that allows us to distribute quality books and gifts to Catholic families, that allows a restoration of quality Catholic study materials, in case where they were going to go back into print. We would have a mechanism for distributing them and making them available. You see in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy how we're trying to develop a system of Catholic education that actually is sustainable by itself in the 21st century and combines the wisdom of the ancients with tools available to us in modern society. You can see in the works that you see me focused on how I'm trying to do this. I mean, this doesn't just benefit my own children. My children use these resources, but they have the same access to them that anyone else has. And I'm not really concerned with just my own children. My children have everything they need. They already have 10 times as much as I had when I was their age. They have everything they need. They need to make good decisions with it. But I'm trying to develop things and make things available and get projects started that benefit everyone, that benefit all Catholic children, all Catholic families. And It's just that there's a lot of stone by stone work that needs to be done, and I'm happy to do it. I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing it. If other people want to help, we'll get a lot done a lot faster. And if nobody helps, I'm just going to keep moving stones and getting these things done until I finally croak, and I'm not going to worry about what didn't get done. I just focus on what can be done. But there's just a need for workers. There's never been a time like this where publishing and communicating is so convenient on a global scale, so affordable, and we're not making good use of it. We're not taking advantage of the opportunities as Catholic laity to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. And we need to focus on this and not get caught up in this selfish nuclear family Catholicism where everyone is competing to try to see who can win best family contest in their parish, and there's no such contest. So if you're interested, there's a million things you can do, and I'd love to help you find something that you can devote yourself to as a Catholic adult that gives you a meaningful apostolate of your own to work on and devote yourself to for the benefit of the broader Catholic community. I think that it's very encouraging in our Catholic life when we have something to work on like this. That's why in the Dominican community, an apostolate is an essential part of the Dominican life. There has to be some outlet, something you do. You contemplate, not just to hoard, contemplative ideas and thoughts and inspirations, but to share the fruits of that contemplation. That's loving your neighbor. You can love God through contemplation, but God didn't simply say, I want you to love me. That's not the commandment. The commandment is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so there has to be some kind of apostolate where our Christian life reaches out and benefits others. That's what it means to love your neighbor, to do to your neighbor what you wish someone would have done to you. That's the golden rule. So there's tons of work to do. This is not work that anyone gets paid for. I don't get paid for all the work I do. I'm not getting paid for this video right now. I'm not getting paid for, when I sit and do hundreds of hours of grading of student work, nobody's paying for that work. Parents, if you look at the rate that we charge for enrollment in the academy, I charge $25 for a month per student for our entire curriculum. And these kids are submitting hours and hours of grading work for me to do. And the work doesn't get paid. You're not going to get rich doing this work. It's not like some modern career where you say, how much am I going to get paid? And if you pay me enough, then I'll do. This is work that has to get done. It has to get done whether it pays $1,000 or $0. The work has to get done. And it's a moral decision. It's a moral and religious mission. It's not a professional mission. And that's what we have to get our minds wrapped around. This is work that has to get done by the laity, whether there's money for it or not. Teresa of Avila didn't get paid to reform the Carmelite order and found monastery or convents. She didn't get paid for that. It's work that needs to get done. It's good moral work that needs to get done for the benefit of our fellow Christians, and there's no one to pay us for it. It's work that we have to do at our own cost. It's a different kind of work. And there are opportunities to generate some revenue that supports the work or may make it more effective. And then there's a lot of work that needs to get done where there's no, look at the classical radio station that I started. I have to pay all the monthly costs. I have to buy all the music. I don't get any money from that. There's no ads or anything. To be valuable, it needs to be ad free. There's no revenue from that. It's all expense. It's all expense because we have to promote and preserve Catholic culture in music. We have to do it. It's not, we don't do it if there's some kind of business plan that makes us money. There's morally necessary work that needs to be done at our expense, not for our profit, but at our expense. And we have to have a more generous attitude towards that work, because none of it's going to get done if it's only going to be done by people who profit from it. It's just, there's no profit. Jesus didn't get paid to heal the sick. It's moral work that needs to get done. The works of mercy are not paid jobs. They're works of mercy that we do for the sake of our own salvation and for the glory of God and for the good of our neighbors. We need to do these things. And it's this sacrificial, volunteer, apostolate work of Christian laymen and women that makes Catholic culture beautiful. And we have to learn to do that work. So it's moving stone by stone. You don't have to be a billionaire. You don't have to donate $1 million to get started. You do what you can. You do as much as you can based on your circumstances. And whether it's moving one stone at a time or grabbing truckloads and moving truckloads at a time, that's ultimately in God's control. And it's for us to determine how much we'd like to do. But it has to get done. And we've got to get to work on it. So there are many ways that you can help me. And like I said, I'm not looking for employees. I'm not interested in working to make a profit so that I can give you money to do work that needs to get done. We have work to do that doesn't make profit, that doesn't pay for itself. And the goal in education is to make the education better and better and better and make the tuition lower and lower and lower. It's not a business. It's not an industry where we're trying to make the profit higher and higher and higher over time. It's the opposite. We're trying to make it more and more affordable over time. And one of the ways we do that is by having Catholics collaborate to work sacrificially to get that work done and make these benefits available to the next generation. So I've already got a number of these projects started which just need help. And if you're interested in helping, there's a million ways you can help. But what we need are helpers. We need people who, like us, want to do this work. They're not just unemployed people looking for a job. Nobody cares if you need a job. Everybody needs a job. There's Christian work that needs to be done, and there's no pay for it, and it's got to be done by Christians. And if we don't do it, what are we really doing? What are we doing? We're leaving the next generation in an even worse situation than we were in our generation. So I'd like to challenge homeschooling parents. Think beyond homeschooling. Think beyond your own children. Think of your whole Catholic life and what needs to be done. You see it in your own children's lives, and you undertake homeschooling because you want to be a solution. You want to provide the solution for your own children. But you've got to think beyond that, because that same situation applies to the whole Catholic community. There are problems that affect the whole Catholic community, and we're the solutions. We're the solution to them, just as we're the solution to the problem of education in our children's lives. We're the solution to many of these cultural problems for the next generation. And we've got to get to work on these issues just as we got to work on our children's education. Nobody paid us to homeschool. There was no profit to be sought in homeschooling. We undertook it for moral reasons. We sacrificed for moral reasons. And you can see that we can understand that when it's just our own children. But the reality is we have to love our neighbor more broadly than just our children. And that's why we can't allow homeschooling to become a black hole, because we're accountable to more than just our own family. And again, these kids are going to grow up and leave home. And we're going to have another 20 years, God willing, to live as Catholic adults. What is our overall mission in Catholic life? That's what I'd like to challenge homeschool parents to think about, because if we don't have a big picture overall for our Catholic life, homeschooling just becomes a black hole that consumes everything. And there's really no need to do that with homeschooling. It doesn't produce better results, and it can actually cause homeschooling to fail by a number of different means. So I hope that that's challenging and encouraging. I hope you find that inspiring in the sense that there's a lot of great work to do, and it doesn't require millions of dollars. It's not for millionaires. It doesn't require artificial academic degrees. You don't need a PhD, as if that means anything in real life. It takes Christian workers. It takes Christian people who are just willing to move stones, as many as they can, humbly working with their own gifts and abilities, and offering their own time and energy as their sacrifice. So if you have ideas of how to serve God in that way, go for it. If you want to serve God in that way but don't know practically how or where you can do it, if you don't have your own apostolate, as it were, and you'd like to know what kind of work there is available that needs to be done, I can share a lot of ideas with you about ways that you can to help to improve things. And I just ask that you get in touch, because there's so much work to do, and we need to have an apostolate directing our Christian life, or else we just get lost in this, black hole of spiritual greed, as it were, just investing everything in ourselves, which is just a dead end. So I hope that's helpful. If you'd like to talk about these things more, please get in touch, because there's plenty to do. God bless.